I want to talk a little bit today about Native American languages. I have a couple of goals today, and that's just to briefly survey a little bit of the complexity of this continent, a little bit of the history and the prehistory. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how not to investigate the history of the languages of this continent. And also, we'll sort of end with some interesting ways that people of this continent were known for using language creatively. First, we should talk about how to talk about these people in general. Typically, we should kind of default to talking about Native American people, Native American tribes. However, it is still common to hear people talk about and to use the term American Indian or just Indian. That is considered offensive still, especially more and more nowadays. Especially in older works, you'll see reference to American Indian. And occasionally within the community, you'll hear people refer to themselves as American Indian. Sometimes it's different when outsiders refer to people that way. More and more, you'll see people referring to themselves and wishing to be referred to as indigenous, especially capitalized. However, other terms are typically not appropriate in a U.S. context. Aboriginal is an Australian term, First Nations, typically a Canadian term. Regardless of however you want to talk about all of the people we're talking about today, they represent hundreds of distinct, mutually unintelligible languages that existed before Columbus, many of which still exist today, that are split across some 60 language families. And as we've talked about in previous classes, they're not totally evenly distributed throughout the continent. There are little hotspots of real diversity, as well as other areas where there's a little bit less. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is based on a book by Amerind Mithun called The Languages of Native North America. And she's another just absolute legend in this area. And the book is a really nice reference for your shelf if you're into that kind of thing. This is the map that she distributes within the book, Languages of Native North America. And this is a pretty good map for all of our sort of purposes. As you can see, in California, we have this hugely densely populated whole entire coastline running all the way up almost to, Alaska. Huge numbers of different kinds of languages spoken all together. The Canadian plains and the American plains, a little bit less though, but still huge numbers of different people that were all sort of present here at the earliest time of contact. These maps are always sort of creative fictions because we're representing kind of different pieces of time together, but they're still really useful representations just of how many different people there are and were here before European contact. Note also nearby us here in the Midwest, there's a giant gap that represents a bit of Ohio, a bit of Indiana, a bit of Pennsylvania, some other sort of areas today. This is not an accident. There is just very little that remains known about this. Records were lost, things were destroyed, and so we're still not sure of what the people here called themselves, what kind of language they spoke. Before we move on too much further, we should talk about a guy named Joseph Greenberg. We talked about him in previous classes, and he's a really important figure when it comes to typology, but when it comes to historical linguistics, his legacy is a little bit more complicated. As we just talked about, there are dozens of language families across Native North America. These languages cannot be proven to be related to each other. That's why we, as historical linguists, place them into different families. However, Joseph Greenberg and some of his students, for example, Merritt Rule and a few others, have proposed that all of the languages of North America are related. That's a little bit overbroad. He really specifically claims that there are 3 families in North America. One is Amerind, and there are 2 other small ones, but I won't get into the details of that proposal here. Anyway, he calls this the Amerind family, and a concerningly large number of people in the genetics world actually think that this is valid. Whereas proper historical linguists have gone out of their way to try to show that it isn't. And we'll talk a little bit today about why that's the case. Joseph Greenberg engaged in a method that he called mass comparison. Mass comparison essentially boils down to 3 basic steps. You look at the languages of the world, you find words that are sort of similar and have sort of similar meanings. If they're similar, it must be the case that they're genetically related, and that's the method. In his method, vocabulary is the number 1 piece of this. It's more important than grammar. Grammar was sort of took a back seat as just lexical comparison. So if you look through his work, you get tables and tables that look like this. Some of this data is not trustworthy. That's an unfortunate thing. We have to mention he's got citations for some of this, but some of it isn't extremely well cited. And it turns out that some of this data is not totally accurate. So it's important to note when you look at a table like this, we're not really seeing an argument. We're seeing just sort of some data, and some data that's frankly sometimes not correctly interpreted, not correctly written down, or has been corrected in other sources in specialist work that just Greenberg wasn't aware of. So even though this looks like a lot of really trustworthy work, it's really something that we should take with a huge grain of salt. In real historical linguistics work, it's not always the case that things that are related are that obvious. You know, the thou row in the previous slide shows all these M's. Typically, in real related languages, consider Indo-European. Indo-European has a form 5 that shows up in all these different forms with all these different configurations of consonants and vowels. But we know these things to be related. Real historical linguistic connections are not as obvious as this sort of method relies on. Anyway, back to some history of native North America proper. What you're taking a look at here is Monk's Mound. This is a 10-story earthen work that was created in Cahokia, which is a city in southern Illinois prior to European contact. And before Columbus, this was one of the biggest cities in the world, especially around the 1200s. This city was bigger than London. What you're looking at here is a map of trade routes and major trade centers that stretch throughout the west of the Mississippi area. Native people were in widespread contact, exchanging information, exchanging ideas, exchanging words, exchanging technology, exchanging trade goods. Last time we took a look at a language area, a linguistic area called the Pacific Northwest, and we took a look at a lot of languages that have some really interesting and really complex consonants. This is an example of a Tlingit language, and it's pretty prototypical of the Pacific Northwest. We see a series of plain stops, a series of aspirated stops, a series of ejective or glottalized stops, but we don't see any voiced stops. And importantly, we see only really kind of rare evidence for nasals in a sort of a weird way. In a lot of Native American languages, we see a lot of variation. We see huge variation in syllable structure across the family. There are some languages, like we took a look at last time, that have very complex syllable structures. This is an example of Nootka. And in this, we see this huge stretch and not a single vowel, and it's all totally well-formed syllable structures. A number of the languages of North America, according to Mithun, have phonemic tone. That's what this map is of, by the way. The languages with red or with pink dots have phonemic tone. The languages with white don't. What's also common in a lot of North American languages is vowel harmony. We see this also in a lot of other languages of the world, but this is kind of some famous examples from North American languages. For instance, here we see an alternation of E and U, and this E in heen turns into hoon because it's influenced by this here. Here we see an alternation of A and O, and we see this al turning into ol, again influenced by the presence of this O. This is a sort of an interesting thing where we get spooky action at a distance. We get something influencing something else even though it's not right next to each other. We're also going to take a look at what Marianne Mithun calls in her book special language. That is some sort of special social and cultural registers and ways of using language. These things are still vastly and drastically understudied, frankly. We're going to start by talking about baby talk. We'll talk about animal talk, language play, in particular kinds of like teasing things. And we'll also talk a little bit about men's and women's speech and what that means. First off, baby talk is also sometimes in the kind of psychological, psycholinguistic literature called child-directed speech. I will typically call it baby talk, but you do see CDS used sometimes in the literature. And it is basically the social register, the sort of method of speaking that's reserved for speaking to babies, associated with speaking to babies, or speaking for babies, so speaking on their behalf and voicing their concerns for them. Typical characteristics of baby talk across languages include special intonation patterns, particular kinds of vocabulary or phonological substitutions, like little or whittle instead of little. special morphological, like diminutives, those sorts of things. I'll also say that there's a very important body of work having to do with language socialization that argued in the 1970s and 1980s, especially, that baby talk and child-directed speech is not, in fact, universal. So that's a really great kind of research topic maybe for you. We'll start with the Nootka language, a language we talked about last time, actually. It was, baby talk in this language was first recorded in the 19-teens, and then it was recorded again 75 years later when research on the language recommenced. In terms of sounds, it's associated with a wide range of pitch modulation, very high pitch, as well as whispering kinds of noises, more so than regular speech, as well as vowel lengthening and exaggeration of vowels. That was how Sapir described it anyway. It's also associated with kind of a limited vocabulary having to do with kinship terms, bodily functions, attention-getting devices, right? The sort of basic ways of communicating to babies. Some of those terms are related to words in the language, and some are unique. We also see diminutive morphology being added even in places where it might not be necessary. So this is one of my favorite words in the dictionary, right? Coochie, coochie, coo, right? So there's sort of these diminutive esh that's associated with this suckle verb, even though the adult form of it doesn't have that esh. It's a kind of a baby talk version of it. It's often assumed across languages that baby talk is a simplified form of the language, but that's actually not necessarily the case. Consider this case of this language that we're talking about that has a huge inventory, like most Pacific Northwest languages, of glottalized consonants, complex resonance, and these things do appear to be mostly absent in baby talk. However, most of the most complicated sounds are also pretty rare in the standard language. So is this really a case where the baby talk makes it go away, or is this a case where, well, it's rare and so the babies don't pick up on it until they kind of reach an age of maturity anyway? Consider also the case of the Cocopah language spoken in Arizona. This has an interesting pattern of replacing the onsets of stressed syllables with V. We also get these other kinds of complex phonological substitutions where uvulars become velars, labiovelars become velars, palatals become dentals. We get this fronting. We see R's turning into L's. Again, sort of like little and whittle. Baby talk, however, in many places was just simply not recorded. Can you imagine why that might be? Well, gender is certainly an aspect of that. I mean, when colonizers show up, they're not talking to babies. They're not interviewing women and children first. They're trying to find the men. That was the sort of sexist reality that all this documentation was covered from in the first place. Also, there's sort of sensitivity and intimacy issues. Think about where you might engage in baby talk. You might engage in it with a loved one, with your family, with your intimate relatives. You probably don't give a list of 100 English words and you list, coochie coochie coo as number 1 or jammies as number 2, right? So it's often missed in a lot of language documentation. That's something that we as language documenters today have to think about, is what do people want out of the language documentation that we provide them? Let's talk about language play a little bit, some sort of playful ways of talking about people. The Nootka language also attested a particular set of forms that are used for, reserved for addressing children, unusually short adults, left-handed people, circumcised people. There's a wonderful set of examples from Marianne Mithun's book about speaking to left-handers involves adding a diminutive and a meaningless element ch. So then we get there he is now, but then this is the version for there he is now, that poor little left-handed chap. And it's mostly here being a sort of difference. You can see a difference here as well. When speaking to or of cross-eyed but not blind people, there's an association of the diminutive and changing all sibilants to their corresponding lateral, so the lateral at the same place of articulation. Consider this example. He cuts has these palatal, voiceless sort of sounds, and then those get converted into laterals. However, researchers did note that people, especially adults, were particularly apt to become offended when they were talked to in these patterns. So beware. But it is worth noting, though, there are always these sorts of language games and these aspects of language that we can sometimes miss out on or ignore or erase through previous documentation. Another thing we'll talk about is animal talk. Now, those same sorts of patterns would also be adapted when speaking for animals in the past, especially like legendary figures in those sorts of stories. Now, in this same example of Nootka, we see the deer and the mink character behave linguistically the same as squinty, cross-eyed people. They're marked morphologically the same way. However, in the Kwakwala language group, we see the exact opposite, right? So this is a deep area of language contact that we've talked about before as a language area. So it's not super surprising that we see these sorts of similarities. And here we see an example of the same sort of thing from Quileute. Again, back to the Kokopah example, there's a whole special register that's reserved for speaking with dogs, cats, horses, and as researchers noted, maybe chickens. I assume that means it depends on the person, but it potentially could depend on the chicken. In this register, there is a lateral palatal spirant that's introduced into every single word. Now here's what that sounds like.
Sha, a sha. Sha, a sha.
And so in this special register, here's how you normally would say, "Where have you been?" But if you're scolding your kitty after it's run away, here's how you say it. One of the last big topics we'll talk about is men's and women's language. Now I want to note that I put that in scare quotes, right? Men's and women's language. Well, that's on purpose. That's actually from her original chapter. She called it men's and women's language. There's a reason for that. Those categories, men and women, we kind of take for granted, are not necessarily the same in all the Native American groups that we're talking about on this continent. Actually, complex multi-gender systems were extremely well documented in Native North America. So when I talk about men's and women's language, there's actually a whole world of complexity that I'm kind of covering over. Franz Boas, in his famous research on the Inuktitut language, noted some pretty simple patterns that are kind of typical, that there's a nasalization for particular forms in women that is not present in men. And those sorts of patterns are also pretty well documented, in addition to the vast complexity I alluded to earlier. In the Atsina language, this is an Algonquian language, there evolved a total different register for men sometime in the late 19th century, possibly by influence from a very closely related neighbor. In this system, there's a pattern associated with men, a pattern associated with women, of ch in the men's associating with k for the women, and tia for the men associating with kya for the women. Now, here's a sort of a weird pattern. You might ask yourself, well, did the men's forms come first or did the women's forms come first? And actually, they both did. They both must have evolved at the same time, because in the ch to k correspondence, the women's form is older, and in the ch to k correspondence, the men's form is older. In the Yana language, we also see more systemic grammatical differences between these two registers. Men are associated with a lengthening of vowels and even additional syllables, whereas women are associated with devoicing of final syllables. There's a couple of pretty good examples here from Amerind Mithun's book. The original hypothesis was that men knew the men's forms, and that the women knew kind of everybody's forms. Because you could figure out that the women know the men's forms because they use them. If they're quoting men, if they're talking through or for a man, they'll use the man's forms. And so people said, maybe the men just don't know the women's forms, they don't use them. But actually later research showed that both forms are used by both genders. It has to do with cultural elements that we're not always aware of as outsiders, so we just presume they must have to do with the gender binary, when actually what's going on might be more subtle, might be more complex. I'll leave you with that thought. Next time, stay tuned for next time.